Chapter 22 Discoveries.
When Lena awoke the next morning, she thought there was something wrong with her eyes. Everything had gone gray. She sat up and looked around. No, it wasn't her eyes. It was the air that was wrong. It was so thick she could hardly see through it. The truck was merely a dark shadow. The buildings of the city had vanished entirely. From somewhere in the murk, she heard Casper's voice. He was muttering to himself, as he had been the night before, but she could hear only a low, growly sound, no words. A dark shape appeared and moved towards her. It was Maddie. She bent over and whispered, "Don't get up yet. Lie back down." "What's wrong with the air?" Lena asked her. It's called fog," Maddie said. "It comes in off the water. Now lie down, curl up." Lena lay down and pulled the blanket up under her chin. Maddie knelt beside her and whispered, "Pretend you're sick. Moan and groan a little. Refuse to get up. I'll explain later." Lena followed instructions. She stared up in the swirling grayness and whimpered a little. It wasn't hard to pretend she didn't feel good. She had rarely felt so cold and miserable in her life. She saw Maddie and Casper huddled together, two shadowy humps in the fog. They were talking, and their voices rose, but she couldn't make out what they were saying. She must have gone to sleep again. When she opened her eyes, the fog was thinner. A pale sun, like a circle of paper, shone through it. Without sitting up, she looked around for Maddie, and saw her sitting on the back of the truck, eating. She didn't see Casper anywhere. "Maddie?" she whispered. Maddie jumped down and came over to her. You can get up now," she said. "He's gone." "Gone?" Maddie nodded. "Into the ruins. He won't give up this notion of finding treasure. Something in his mind has slipped, I think. He wasn't all that steady to begin with, and now he's lost his balance." She took Lena's hand and pulled her to her feet, and together they folded the blanket. "He wants you to help him with his search. Go into the small spaces where he can't go. I told him you'd help tomorrow, but today you weren't well. So he went off to look around by himself. Preliminary exploration, he called it." I don't want to help him," Lena said. "You aren't going to," said Maddie. "We're leaving." "We are? When? How?" Lena asked. "Now," said Maddie. "Come and help me." Maddie climbed up onto the truck, unstrapped the two bicycles, and handed them down to Lena. She opened the food chest and took out some of the remaining traveler's cakes, along with 2 water bottles, and she wrapped these in blankets and tied them with rope. "Here," she said to Lena. "This pack is yours, and this bike." "You mean we're going to ride all the way back to Sparks?" Lena thought with horror of the vast empty distance and the blazing heat. "We won't have to ride all that way," Maddie said. "There are lots of roamers. Someone will help us." "And we just leave Casper here by himself?" Lena wasn't sure that even someone as unlikable as Casper should be abandoned in this terrible place. "He'll be fine," said Maddie. "He has his truck and all his supplies. He doesn't need us." So they tied the packs to their backs. They walked the bikes across the rubbly part of the road until they came to the place where it opened out into the long downhill curve. Just then the fog lifted and the air came clear. Lena turned around to take a last look at the city she'd had such hopes for, and the city she thought might be a home for the people of Ember. In the sunlight it looked more sad than terrible. Over the rolling grass-covered mounds, the skeletons of the old towers stood like watchmen. The trees bent their backs before the wind, and the wind swept ripples across the surface of the green-gray water that wrapped around the city's edges. Maybe, Lena thought, the sparkling city she'd seen in her mind was a vision from the distant future, not the distant past. Maybe someday the people of Ember, or the great-great-grandchildren of today's people of Ember, would come back here and build the city again. "All right," said Maddie. "Let's ride." Lena flung her leg over the bike and settled herself on the seat. This was a bigger bike than the one she was used to. She gripped the handlebars, gave a push with her foot, and she was off. From the start, the bike moved so fast she hardly had to pedal. She zoomed forward, going far faster than even her fastest running. The wind in her face swept her hair out behind her, shot through her clothes, and nearly peeled back her eyelids. The bumps in the road made the handlebars buck like something alive. She held on with a steel grip. It was absolutely terrifying and absolutely joyful. Down the long hill they went, she and Maddie alone on the wide, empty highway. No need to pedal at all, only steer around the broken places or bits of debris. The fast air came to Lena's mouth and buffered down into her lungs, and she laughed out loud. It was such a glorious freedom. When the slope leveled out to a little, she steered the bike into big curves back and forth, and Maddie did too. They whooped and laughed and raced each other, and alongside them the white birds swooped too, screeching in their shrill voices. Then came a long stretch of flat road and hard pedaling. With many stops for resting and eating and drinking water, they rode all day. Lena's seat was sore, and her legs grew tired. Blisters rose on her hands from holding so tight to the handlebars. But Maddie said, "Just a little bit farther, and then we'll stop." And Lena kept going, finding strength when she thought there was none, until at last, at the end of the day, they came to the place where the water ended, and they could turn eastward toward the hills. Here they stopped for the night. They found a creek with a trickle of clear water running along the bottom. Maddie said the round green leaves that grew on the creek's banks were good to eat, so they had those with their traveler's cakes, along with some wild onions and a few blackberries they found deep in a thicket of bramble. There was no cold wind here as there had been near the city. The evening was warm still, except for the chirping of frogs the evening was warm and still, except for the chirping of frogs in the creek. They spread their blankets on the ground. Somewhere in the dark an owl hooted softly, and another answered. Maddie was lying on her back with her hands clasped over her wide stomach. To Lena, gazing at her profile against the sky, she looked like a small range of hills, solid and comforting. So Lena dared to ask a question that had been troubling her. "Maddie," she said, "could there ever be another disaster like the one that came before? Or even worse? What if every single person and every single animal was killed?" "Don't worry," said Maddie. "People didn't make life, so they can't destroy it. Even if we were to wipe out every bit of life in the world, we can't touch the place life comes from. Whatever made plants and animals and people springs up in the first place will always be there, and life will always spring up again." Maddie turned over and hugged her blanket around her. "Time to sleep now," she said. "More hard riding tomorrow." In the morning, they were on their way as soon as the sun rose. Lena groaned as she got on her bike again. Her muscles were sore from yesterday, but she soon warmed up, and for a long time the road was flat and the riding was easy. After an hour or so, Lena spotted something moving up ahead of them, a dot in the distance. "Look!" she called to Maddie, who was a little way behind her, and she pointed. "I think it's a truck. Maybe it's a roamer." In 10 minutes or so, they caught up to it. The man driving the truck turned when he heard them calling. Surprise lit up his face, and he halted his oxen and jumped down. "Greetings!" he cried. "Glad to see some travelers. Haven't met anyone on the road for 4 days." He was short, stocky man with a wild fuzz of black hair that stood out several inches all around his head. Pelton Moss was his name, and he was indeed a roamer. As was easy for them to see from the crates and barrels on his truck. All his containers were nearly empty, though. He had sold his most recent load of goods to a remote South Bay settlement. Now he was heading back in the direction of Sparks. "I'll take you with me," he said, "if you'll keep with my collecting on the way." And so, for 5 days, Lena got to be a roamer. At every ancient abandoned town, they stopped and combed through the derelict houses. Not much was left. These houses had been picked nearly clean in the last 200 years. But sometimes, if they looked carefully, they found things the previous roamers had overlooked, or things they had thought worthless. Lena loved these searches. In some ways, it was like being a messenger back in Ember. She could go everywhere, look in every forgotten corner, and if she was lucky, make discoveries. And she was lucky. She found a silver locket with a picture of someone inside. Though the picture was so old and stained, she couldn't tell if it was a woman or a baby. She found a small, round pane of glass with a handle. The glass made whatever you looked at appear bigger. "Ooh, a magnifying glass," said Pelton. "Nice." She found a tiny red truck with wheels that still turned. She found a strip of leather with a buckle and 2 round metal pieces attached to it. It was too short to be a belt. There were words on the metal circles, but they were so worn she couldn't read them. "Ah, that's a dog collar," Pelton told her. "Not very useful, but interesting." At a house that stood by itself far out in the field, she opened a cabinet on the back porch where the screen was hanging in brown flops. In the cabinet was a box that said Monopoly in faded letters on its lid. Inside were tiny dotted cubes and tiny bits of wood shaped like houses. "Wonderful!" Pelton exclaimed. "Extremely rare." There was another box in the cabinet with a picture of a garden on top and a heap of oddly shaped pieces of cardboard inside. And at the back of the cabinet, in a clutter of broken dolls, torn pages from books, and little jars of dried up paint, Lena found a bar of metal about 3 inches long that Pelton said was a magnet. "Put it up against the truck," he said. "It'll stick right there." Even as she enjoyed the searching, though, Lena couldn't help imagining how it would be for the people of Ember to come out into this empty land and try to start a town. How could they turn the hard, cracked earth into fields of crops? What would they build houses with? What would they eat while they chopped at the soil and put together their shelters? A picture rose in her mind of Ember's 400 people, scattered across the brown fields like a flock of lost birds, scratching in the dry grass for seeds or bugs, huddling for shade beneath the few trees, trying to build shelters of sticks or straw. She shuddered and made the picture go away. It was best to keep her attention on searching.